was your main takeaway from that opening statement?
Well, my main takeaway was that Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the Turkish president, was outnumbered and outgunned diplomatically. He kept bringing up this word ceasefire. We should be able to declare a ceasefire today. His main focus is clearly to stop any offensive in Idlib. The other two were having none of it. Putin pushing back against that idea. President Rouhani of Iran doing the same thing. Putin saying, well, the Syrian opposition should keep up its side of the bargain, that they're making provocative measures using drones and so forth. So clearly Putin blaming, at least indirectly, blaming the opposition for the situation in Idlib, not the Syrian government. Meanwhile, clearly Erdogan looking at the Syrian government as the main problem in Idlib. Erdogan saying we don't want a sea of blood in Idlib. He also mentioned moderate opposition groups. The other two made no such distinction. They were simply talking about terrorists. Let's basically get rid of the terrorists. Turkey also talking about terrorist groups, not the ones in Idlib, but something completely different, east of the Euphrates. I think that must have been a reference to Syrian militias. Again, Turkey out on a limb there when it comes to the Kurdish question, or at least that was my reading between the lines. Although I have to say there were some translation issues here, so I can't be 100% sure that that's what Erdogan was talking about. But in general, the gist that I got was that Erdogan was the odd one out here. We'll have to see what the final communique says, but I would be surprised, based on those final exchanges, whether the word ceasefire actually made it into the final declaration.
So where might they find some common ground then?
Well, there's one thing that both of the first two leaders who spoke put a lot of emphasis on, particularly President Rouhani in his initial comments. He talked a lot about refugees and displaced people and the need to settle that situation for them. This was echoed by President Putin, who talked about an office that had been opened in Moscow to work on issues related to repatriation of Syrian refugees. So clearly all of this was aimed at mollifying President Erdogan, because, of course, Turkey has shouldered those refugees. In fact, Turkey has an estimated 3 million Syrian refugees at least. But it's interesting that that didn't really seem to chime that much with Erdogan. He didn't himself talk a lot about the refugee issue in his own country. He was really...
Except to say they've come to an end to what they can take.
Yeah, and he was really pushing back on the political front against Putin and Rouhani on the question of terrorism, on the question of the Assad regime's methods and actions, and obviously on the Kurdish issue, at least indirectly. And so all of this, I think, shows just how difficult Turkey's position has been in this tripartite summit. Again, we'll have to look at the final declaration, Nadia, but I suspect that Turkey probably didn't get nearly as much as it wanted in terms of separating who is a terrorist, who isn't, and whether one can really separate moderates from extremists. That was clearly Turkey's strategy going into this meeting, but we'll have to see whether it achieved much on that.
And the rest of the world, namely the West, has been left out of this discussion. But the US did come under serious criticism from all three. Is that the common denominator?
Well, in a way, but that doesn't mean to say that the interests of the US and these three separate entities might not coincide at some point further down the line. You know, the US is still a player. It still does have troops in northern Syria, and clearly Turkey is going to have to maintain a relationship with the US as a NATO member. It already did work with the US in terms of at least informally separating out zones of influence in northern Syria to try and create a kind of buffer against Kurdish fighting forces. It already came to some sort of understanding with the US a few months ago on that. tensions obviously very high now between Iran and the US because of various other issues, not just the Syrian question. Russia, again, Russia's going to have to come to some sort of entente with the US and Turkey when it comes to the broad contours of a Kurdish presence in northern Syria. So everything is still, in a sense, up for grabs. But I think, again, to come to the main point, Idlib is really the key question right now, Nadia, what happens there. And the military conflict in Idlib is obviously going to shape the sort of diplomatic contours in the future between these powers that are present, but also with those powers that are not present, including the US and the EU. And it was interesting that President Rouhani mentioned the international community needing to rebuild Syria. So he's already sort of looking, I think, effectively, he's looking beyond Idlib already and saying, look, if and when this is all over, the international community has to finance the reconstruction of Syria. That, of course, is going to mean the European Union as well. What is the EU going to think about cooperating with Bashar al-Assad and giving money to reconstructing Syria?
Destroyed. Thank you very much.